The scene of a Hamas rocket hit home in the southern coastal town of Ashkelon. The group that controls Gaza firing a barrage across its border after issuing Israel with an ultimatum to withdraw forces from the Al-Aqsa compound, drawing retaliatory airstrikes from Israel.
The IDF has conducted strikes against military targets in Gaza, killing more than 15 Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists while they were trying to plan or execute attacks against Israel. And we stand prepared and ready with various capabilities at our disposal should Hamas and other terrorists decide to escalate the situation.
More than 24 Palestinians were killed overnight in Gaza, while reports of Israeli casualties also emerged from the strikes. After days of violent clashes at the Al-Aqsa compound saw hundreds injured over clashes related to the status of East Jerusalem that Palestinians seek as a future capital of an independent state.
What is happening in Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Israeli aggression against worshippers and our families in Jerusalem, is part of a mass Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people all over the Palestinian territories, in the West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, and even occupied Palestine.
A closed-door session of the UN Security Council Monday failed to produce a clear way forward, while Washington indicated it was working behind the scenes to restore calm.
Violence needs to cease. All sides need to de-escalate, reduce tensions, take practical steps to calm things down. I appreciate some of the steps we've seen in the last 24 hours, particularly with regard to rerouting the parade and putting off a decision on the evictions, but it's imperative that all sides take steps to de-escalate and calm the situation. And again, I'm deeply concerned about the rocket attacks, and even as all sides take steps to de-escalate, Israel, of course, has a right to defend its people and its territory from these attacks.
Despite these calls for calm, Israel's Prime Minister has warned that the fighting could drag on after rockets reach the outskirts of Jerusalem.
The Secretary General expressed his deep concern over the continuing violence in occupied East Jerusalem, as well as the possible eviction of Palestinian families from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan neighborhoods. He urges Israel to cease demolitions and evictions in line with obligations under international humanitarian and international human rights law. Israel authorities must exercise maximum restraint and respect the right of freedom of peaceful assembly. All leaders have a responsibility to act against extremists and to speak out against all acts of violence and incitement. The Secretary General urges that the status quo of the holy sites be upheld and respected.
Egypt, Qatar and the UN, regular mediators between Israel and Palestine, are reportedly working to prevent a major confrontation. Israel's Supreme Court postponing a ruling on planned Palestinian evictions from East Jerusalem Monday, where Israeli settlers and officials continue to battle over the transfer of properties and land in what the United Nations Human Rights Office in Geneva says is a violation of international law and may amount to war crimes. Shervin Bricepies, SABC News, New York.
Right, for more on this, we're now joined by Professor Henny Strydom, who's a professor in public international law at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, great to see you again. A warm welcome to SABC News. Thanks for your time.
Good afternoon. Good to see you.
Prof, I mean, it does seem that other countries are either unwilling or unable to do something about this conflict. I mean, apart from the condemnations of the violence, I mean, it doesn't seem that there is an active move to kind of do something about it. I'm going to pick on the US for the moment, just because they're the ones that have, called for violence to cease and the parties to calm the situation. Usually, they tend to take this whole big brother approach to issues such as these and actively doing something about it. Is it a question of either not being able or not being not being willing to, or is it really both?
Yeah, it could be both. I mean, we've seen these kinds of responses to the conflict many times over, and we will see them in future as well. So this is it has become a pattern of responses and a pattern of tit for tats between the rival groups. And it's all rooted within the political issues surrounding the occupied Palestinian territories. And this will go on until that issue has been resolved. And it will have to be resolved not only by the parties, but also by the international community.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of Arab region has a vested interest in actively pursuing a solution, more actively, and also the major powers in the world. So, and behind it all is the big question that has been part of the international law response to the conflict, is the self-determination of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, and speaking of international law, no doubt there have been attempts to find some sort of, political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We can talk about around the Oslo framework, for example. Why is nothing working? Why are none of these international instruments perhaps not assisting in any of this?
Yeah, it's an enforceability issue, because in order to make it work, you need the cooperation of the parties involved, Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
And as long as they fight over how to enforce it or how to implement it or how to understand it, there will be little progress. At one point in time, if I remember correctly, there was high hopes that the two-state solution would solve the problem. And I think that proposal has now also been diminished in relevance over time, because of opposition to that from certain Palestinian quarters. And at one point there was the one-state solution. So this is one of many fights that are ongoing between the two groups. And sometimes one gets the impression that there's no end to the story. But it can't go on like this. There will have to be a solution found, and it will have to be implemented at one point or another, because it has severe impact on the region, the economy of the region, and the civilians who are caught between these conflicting rivals.
And speaking of those civilians, I mean, many people have been killed, and many more, unfortunately, it seems, will still be killed through this conflict. Even if other countries won't step in, there's no doubt that with this sort of intense or intensified conflict, what usually comes out of it is a humanitarian crisis, and it might in fact be late already. The humanitarian crisis might already be there as we speak. Surely that should then be speaking to the collective conscience of other countries, and perhaps particularly the US, as I said before, they like to take the big brother approach. Surely there should be some sort of collective consciousness that kicks in at some point when we see this humanitarian crisis that will inevitably come out of this, or has already.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, you always have the spillover affecting neighboring countries and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where, the interests of many countries are involved and are affected. So you need a sort of concerted effort by many who might become directly or indirectly the victim of these conflicts. And we must also not forget that part of the problem is a sort of power struggle in the region between the two groups. You can see that in the kind of military hardware and military attacks used in response to certain issues, which then provokes the other side to respond with even more force.
Yeah.
And this is also a pattern in the conflict, and it has been like that. And I can very vividly recall the previous conflict in 2014. Which left in excess of 1,000 of people dead. And we can only hope that there will be some kind, even if it's a diplomatic solution, to prevent this current one from escalating to the same level.
Yeah. Will the imposition of sanctions help at all? I'm hearing, of course, that there are these calls to impose sanctions. And I mean, what happens in a case where neither of the parties actually care whether sanctions are imposed or not?
Yeah, I'm fortunately or unfortunately one of those persons who do not have much belief in sanctions because they're always circumvented, and we have many problems of that in many other parts of the world. So I think in the case of Israel especially, it will have little effect. I mean, it might even hurt the Palestinians more than it will hurt the Israelis. So I don't think that it could be part of several attempts, but I must tell you, I have little faith in sanctions.
Yeah. Prof, let's leave it there. Thank you so very much for giving us your time again. Much appreciated.